and the existing fleet was phased out and a new fleet was phased in, would we still need to reduce vehicle miles and miles of travel in your view in response after that occurred?
A lot of ifs in that scenario. The people who have looked at this seriously believe that because the existing vehicle fleet turns over slowly, and because the alternatives, the low emission alternatives, or potentially low emission alternatives, often rely on coal-fired power plants to produce the electricity, which then powers the vehicles, that the technology has its limits. The graphs I showed you with the different lines, red lines and green lines and so on, were our best guess at just how much could be accomplished through more fuel efficient and lower carbon content fuels. But we didn't see any way to get down to the red line without reducing the amount of horse miles traveled.
Reid, may I add
Yes.
to that, please? It's important to remember when we're using terms like zero-emission vehicle that the California mandate originally referred to zero emissions from the tailpipe at the place where the car was, because LA and San Francisco and a number of the other cities had very unhealthy local air, and those cars were going to be powered probably by electricity, some of which was going to come from hydro in California, much of which was going to come from coal plants in Arizona. That's not a zero-emission vehicle from a GHG perspective. And so I think that thinking about this technological panacea that the energy is going to magically come from some place that we haven't discovered yet is something that we need to get over in a hurry. And be very careful of phrases like zero-emission vehicles, because they have a very specific technical meaning, and at this point that one is about 20 years old.
Other questions?
Dave Van Haddam, Transit for Livable Communities. I think it was your comments, Reid, you said that California is moving forward with regional targets, and the regions are going to have to meet the target. But then after that, you said California is only going to be using an incentive approach. And so I'm curious from all the speakers if incentives, number one, if incentives are enough, and two, if that's the approach we're going to take, where does the funding come from? I know it's the huge question, but some more specificity on incentives versus disincentives, and maybe more detail on the incentive side.
Well, good question. This is just my sense. The fact that the approach taken is incentive-based as opposed to regulatory was a political compromise. The example of Portland, Oregon, and Oregon generally, and its growth management, it is almost 100% regulatory. And I think there was a feeling probably among the participants in the political process that it would be better if they had a combination of the two, more likely to succeed, but that what would sell at that time was two types of incentives. And one is strictly spending money, and we're talking about the same amount of money, the same pot of money, but you can spend it on greenfield development, roads to nowhere, or you can spend it on infill, a whole range of multimodal transportation projects in central cities. And same amount of money, spending it in smart growth areas was one incentive. And the other was just to expedite, and I guess the third speaker mentioned that, expedite the permitting process for smart growth projects, for these transit priority projects. That is sort of regulatory, but incentive as opposed to urban growth boundaries or something like that. So what happens if they don't meet the requirements? I don't think anyone has quite figured that out, but there is talk of having stricter standards in the future. If the incentive-based approach doesn't work, requiring urban growth boundaries, requiring impact fees, that are based on carbon emissions. Those sorts of things would be the next round in California. Questions for other speakers? Yes?
Thank you. My name is Mary Tkach. I'm a sustainability consultant. And my question is really around the possibility of urban-rural friction when you look at some of the recommendations that could come from these various and sundry scenarios. And could anyone on the panel articulate some of the possibilities for how we show benefit to the rural communities or suburban communities when you're dealing with issues that are going to dramatically benefit, financially, cost everyone, but dramatically benefit the urban areas, and vice versa?
I'll start if I may, Reid.
Please.
The term rural sprawl has now, unfortunately, entered our vocabulary. And I think that there are a lot of rural communities which are struggling with the implications of that pattern and are eager to save money from stepping back from that a little bit. The school districts were hit with, now we have these multi-city schools which have a very large student catchment area, enormous school bus gasoline bills, right? I can imagine that there are a number of rural areas which would be, now, somebody's going to have to move to one school or another, right? But putting the school back where it used to be in the center of town so that the net amount of travel falls, net money saver. Doesn't cost everybody, saves most people money, certainly saves the school district a lot of money. There are issues of community versus rural governance, not on a metro versus outstate basis, but in individual counties, cities, and that are having substantial discussions around annexation issues. The Walmart moves just outside the city boundary. Who gets that tax increment? Who pays for the road out to it? Who pays for the sewer out to it? And these are developments that I think have not, in the end, saved rural or largely rural areas money. I think they have, in the end, cost them money. Now, I'm not here to make that statement on a blanket basis, but to answer your question, I think there's a lot of savings out there, and it's not a simply metro versus outstate issue. It's an issue that individual, and I expect we'll hear, and I hope we'll hear from John briefly, that these are issues that the communities themselves need to work out, hopefully without the distorting effect of money coming in that will only pay for, a new sewer line, for example. And so, well, if the only way we can get this money is to build a new sewer line, then let's build it out of town and impose all these other costs on other people.
Your question is actually pretty encompassing and could take a long time to really answer it. But one of the things that we tried to look at in our study was really looking at what the land in our rural areas is best suited for. Especially if we're talking about growing fuels and crops in the future for biofuels, rather than having incentives that cause people to grow corn where the land is actually better suited for something else, to make sure that there aren't disincentives to do that. But when it comes to urban growth, I've always favored the term planned growth areas as opposed to urban growth boundaries. And the way we've liked to approach it is to first get people to come to grips with how much are we likely to grow in the future. And then we can all agree that the best way to grow is in the most cost-effective way, where we spend our infrastructure dollars more wisely. So a lot of times if I'm involved in a regional growth process, I would rather have people, the local units of government, come up with where they'd like to grow, logically extending contiguous urban growth, rather than drawing a line in the sand. Because if you draw a line in the sand, there's somebody who's on the other side of the line. And I've been at 5,000 public hearings, actually more. And there's somebody who's on the other side of the line. It says, Earl's in Florida with his feet up, drinking a, drink with an umbrella in it, and you're telling me, my land's got to be out here for soybeans or CRP land. So, I think if you can just try and avoid some of that us versus them stuff and still employ some logical principles, you can get to the same place.
Steve tells me we've run out of time for questions and answers right now. We'll be staying around, or at least 3 of us will be. So please feel free to approach us with any questions, comments. Thank you all for, particularly the legislators, for attending, and let's thank the speakers for excellent presentations.